Hello and welcome to CIPR TV, brought to you by the CIPR Social Media Panel and Marketeers 4DC. I'm Philip Sheldrake. This show focuses on ethical questions raised by public relations practice. For example, in whose interest is it practice? How should it make use of information? Is it actually informative or persuasive or indeed misleading? And does it really have obligations to serve a broader public interest? Joining me in the studio today are Dr Jon White, PR consultant, strategist and author of the CIPR's PR 2020 report. If you've not seen that, check it out on the CIPR's website, it's a cracking read. And Eliane Glaser, Guardian columnist and author of Get Real, How to Tell It Like It Is in a World of Illusions. And there you go, now you've seen it. Now, Eliane and Jon, welcome. We have some interesting topics to go through in just 20 short minutes. The book posits that PR and marketing have helped create a looking-glass world in which reality is spun and vested interests appear in disguise. Only by spotting illusions and declaring agendas, Eliane argues, can we improve our world for real. So an interesting, controversial topic. And as usual with CIPR TV, we're giving you the chance to join in the discussion too. So if you have any questions you'd like to put to Jon or Eliane, you can use the submission box on the page or tweet questions and your general commentary with the hashtag #CIPRTV. Right, so we get stuck in. Eliane, maybe I can ask you, could you give us a sort of a 30-second overview of your book?
Sure, well it might be a bit longer than 30 seconds, but I argue in short that there's so many aspects of our modern world that aren't what they seem. So in the book I discuss things like greenwash, where oil companies have petrol stations coloured an environmentally friendly shade of green, or Edinburgh Airport that's paid school children to plant trees to beef up their environmental credentials, or so-called AstroTurf campaigns where companies or millionaires or politicians organise what seem to be grassroots campaigns but are actually organised from above, or when celebrities or members of the royal family are filmed or photographed using public transport to portray them as just like you or I, or when so-called plus-size models appear on the front of magazine covers that suggest that the modelling industry is not full of size zero models. So I'm talking about aspects of our modern world in which the truth is airbrushed and touched up. We live in an age where internet technology is expanding, where journalism is decreasing in influence, and that creates a world in which, in a sense, we can create our own reality. But that means also that we don't have so much access to evidence, to empirical reality. And I suppose what I'm calling for is more awareness of those kinds of methods. And I suppose that PR, advertising and marketing does have a part to play in that.
So can I just ask, did you write the book just because these things really wind you up? Or do you have a way in which you see the world moving beyond the kind of stuff that you've just described?
Well, I did write the book because these things really wind me up. But I suppose there's an important point at stake here, in my view, which is that we live in a society that's becoming ever more divided in terms of socio-economic factors. The rich are getting richer and the poor aren't really getting much richer themselves. Social inequality is increasing, and I feel that these sort of airbrushed truths actually serve to conceal the fact that socio-economic inequality is increasing, so that PR costs money and powerful interests, ruling elites, if you like, have the resources to pay for PR, and therefore we have to follow the money, and we have to look at powerful interests which are using PR to present themselves in a positive light. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with that, but I think there needs to be more public awareness of how that goes on.
Jon, that's a hell of a conclusion to reach about the PR profession. Is it one that you can sympathise with?
No, absolutely. I think we can recognise these features of public relations practice going back to the origins of public relations practice in in the US, where public relations as a practice was developed to defend the interests of corporations. So its early history, certainly in the US, was as a practice to defend interests. And I mean, we've been moving on from that ever since. So we're looking at an evolving practice which we need now to really understand how it does exert its influence. It's a practice which has to be much more open to public scrutiny. Mm-hmm. And I think in the Chartered Institute of Public Relations there is a wish to look at this scrutiny of public relations practice and learn from it. So that's why I think it's very good that Eliane brings these issues out for discussion.
So of the kind of things that Eliane was just describing there, do you see them as breaches of the CIPR's Code of Conduct, bending of the CIPR Code of Conduct, or actually within the Code of Conduct?
Not within the Code of Conduct, but these are realities of practice at the present time, which we all recognise. We know that the larger corporation will have the resources to be able to employ many public relations representatives to defend its interests. Against that, you would have to say that not-for-profit organisations, NGOs, pressure groups, are actually more credible than corporations when they use public relations practitioners and techniques. So they have an advantage of credibility going into public debate. So these are features of modern-day practice for examination. Mm-hmm. And at this stage in the evolution of public relations practice, we're turning more and more attention to these questions of practice. It's not just in public relations. I mean, just as an aside, we're also looking at practice in the media, and the Leveson inquiry is a perfect example of that, that we're beginning to learn more about the practices that shape the society that we live in.
And of course, lobbying is under the lens as well at the moment.
Of course.
So in many ways, these professions have a full spectrum of practice, from the very best practice, whatever that might be, but ethics is going to feature up that end of the spectrum.
Yes, and it would apply in
feature
other
less down
in other professions as well. When you think about problems in the medical profession, the legal profession, each profession raises its own ethical issues for examination, and as public relations evolves, the ethical issues raised in practice are brought to the surface for examination.
So how do we define ethics in this context? Do you have a framework in mind by which we can ascertain whether an organisation's communications with the outside world is, I'm not sure it's black and white, could you say ethical or not, or how would you go about even approaching that?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the origins of PR, John, because PR was pioneered by an ex-theatrical agent and nephew of Sigmund Freud, Edward Bernays, and he wrote a book called Propaganda in I think 1920, in which he set out his methods of what PR was, and he was strikingly honest about what PR was for.
Yes, he talked about the engineering of consent.
Exactly, and that the need to mould the mind of the masses.
Yes.
And I'd recommend Propaganda to anyone. It's a fascinating book. But what's striking about that book is that it's so honest about PR's methods and the way that PR organises news events and so on, the way it organises grassroots public opinion and moulds the message. So I suppose my view is that I support his honesty about PR's methods, and I think what's changed is that in our age there's a lot of talk of participation, of consumer power, of the power of ordinary people, people power. I think that's it's partly a product of the internet age that it's all about two-way communication. We're not just being sort of lectured at by the media or by politicians, and that sounds great in theory, but I think that language of participation, of transparency, of two-way debate is double-edged, because on the one hand, we do have the power to talk back with the internet, but on the other hand, I think that creates a false sense of security in terms of giving the impression of a level playing field between, say, corporations and politicians and the public. And I suppose what I would argue for in terms of ethics is, in a sense, a return to Edward Bernays, a return to that sort of honesty about saying, look, we are framing the message. Messages are always going to be framed for good or ill. And let's have a really honest conversation about that, which isn't saying this is a level playing field between consumers and corporations. It's saying, actually, corporations are framing their messages, and that's fine. You know, they're making a profit, but let's be upfront about that.
So we have a question that's come in via Twitter. Actually, that's a very good moment to remind you that you can take part in the Twitter commentary at #CIPR TV and send in your questions. We have one here from Stuart Hillis, directed at you, John, about the fact that organisations are starting to merge, or maybe not sufficiently distinguishing between marketing and public relations. We often hear the two joined together as if they go together hand in hand. Do you agree that this taints the credibility of any press release from a press office and devalues the brand? Is that part of the problem?
This is another huge debate about the relationship between public relations and marketing. I mean, you know that many people will say that public relations is a part of marketing, and it really does devalue public relations to see it simply as a part of marketing. It's got another contribution to make to organizations, which has to do with the sort of relationships that are developed between organizations and other groups than those represented in the market. But I would really like to go back to what Eliane was just saying about a return to the honesty of Edward Bernays, because there are practitioners, well-respected practitioners, currently leading the practice. I'm thinking in particular of Harold Burson, who still cites Bernays' definition of public relations with approval, that Bernays was talking about the need to work on relationships to influence them, so that so that organizations can move forward. So he was honest about what he was trying to do in practice, and that's really what we've got to move to, is a more honest understanding of the practice that we're involved in. And this is back to the discussion we had last time. I was sitting on this sofa about definitions. What exactly is public relations to achieve? It's a practice which is directed towards influencing people in relationships. So it involves persuasion, it involves framing the message, certainly, but why shouldn't we recognize that and say that's what we do? Yeah. We do work to persuade and to influence, to frame messages, and that's part of what we do.
So, Eliane, I wonder if there might be a contradiction. I'm sure you're going to tell me there isn't. Because I'm picking up this idea that you would like us to move away from, say, maybe propaganda end of the communication spectrum towards factual exchange for the betterment of society. And yet in your book, you're quite a big fan of ideology. Long live ideology is a section I've just opened up to here. How do you reconcile the two? Because ideology almost smacks of, don't mind the facts. This is the way. Follow me.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I suppose that, the subtitle of my book is How to Tell It Like It Is in a World of Illusions. And so I believe that, what I'm arguing for is not so much a return to truth as such, or reality as such, because obviously we do make our own realities to a certain extent. But what I'm arguing is for people to state what they believe in. Ideology is a dirty word in political discourse. Politicians always say, I'm not doing this, because I'm driven by ideology. I'm doing this because that's what works. But I want people to get real in the sense of being explicit about what they're actually arguing for. If they want to frame a message, that's fine, but say, this is my agenda, this is my ideology. But I think in our age, because we believe that ideologies are a thing of the past, they're sort of to do with tribal politics, that we've moved away from, because people believe that this is an era of pragmatism, of transparency, of down-to-earth reality, that authenticity, that actually conceals agendas. And so those agendas haven't really gone away. Politicians still have a message that they're trying to get across. Corporations still have products that they're trying to sell. But that process is going on under the radar. So at the same time as PR and marketing, obviously I don't want to talk about them in the same breath, but at the same time as those techniques have become very sophisticated, we're also somehow under the misapprehension that this culture is about transparency, it's about authenticity, you know, it's about politicians telling it like it is. You know, it's about John Major, you know, getting on his soapbox, it's about Cameron rolling up his sleeves and, you know, giving press conferences in tractor warehouses. It's all about, you know, down-to-earth reality, and that the idea that we could be framing messages has sort of become a taboo in our culture.
So do you give any advice to PR practitioners? I guess let's restrict it to the UK, because North America does seem to be still quite interested in ideologue, not least of which the Tea Party. But like, I know what you mean about politics and the media in the UK. It seems to be looking for consensus, facts, data. In fact, there was a session in the Public Relations Society of America last month where we were talking about data-driven communications. As if there was going to be any other kind of communications going forward, because if you could rely back on fact, your argument is easier to make. Except, of course, you can draw different conclusions from the same set of data. So given this confusing space we're in, what advice would you both give to a PR practitioner who's looking to up the ethics?
Well, I think there's too much emphasis on truth and lies. You know, I think in the public perception, you know, people accuse PR the PR industry of lying, and I think that's a real red herring. You know, I don't think that there's any bad faith here. I think that the real issue is the relationship between corporations, politicians and the public, and I think what we're seeing now is a sort of a collusion. You know, that relationship is in a way too cosy. So it's not about truth and reality, it's about questioning how that relationship works. And I suppose if I was going to give advice to the PR industry, I would say be upfront about your methods. You know, that's how you're going to gain trust with the public. It's not by saying PR is about honesty and truth. It's about saying messages are framed. That's what this business does. You know, corporations want to sell products. You know, so let's be more upfront about those techniques. You know, advertising enjoys a much higher profile in a sense as an industry in the public. You know, people watch Mad Men and so on, whereas PR, I think, has a much lower profile in terms of, you know, as it appears as an industry, and I think that's really bad. I think that the public should be aware of PR as an industry. I mean, I guess there's a paradox in the sense that PR is sort of necessarily invisible, that if you can see the work of PR, in a sense it's failed, unlike advertising, which is, you know, you can see an advert in a newspaper and you know that it's an advert, not an editorial. But I think that PR would do well to have a conversation with the public, not in terms of saying, you know, we're always telling the truth, but saying messages are framed and this is how we do it.
So that age-old thing about public relations having a reputation problem, John. But back to that original question.
Definitely, but actually I don't see a problem with the term framing a message. I see that as a way you're developing and presenting arguments in public. And I think that's what we don't do a good enough job at the moment, explaining that that's part of what we do in public relations, is that we develop arguments for presentation in public. And I do see that actually as something that is in the public interest, that in order to deal with the problems that we are facing, you know, as a society, economically, politically, and so on, it's in everybody's interests that arguments are developed with clarity and debated thoroughly. So if we make clear that that's part of what public relations does, as part of the work that it is involved in, I think that would be to the benefit of public understanding of public relations. I think to answer the question about advice for public relations practitioners as a group when it comes to ethics, we've got to be clear about what it is we're doing as a practice, and then we've got to establish the rules by which we're going to operate to conduct that practice in the right way. So I mean, you're involved in this work with Wikipedia at the moment, and that's exactly what you're doing. Recent developments in practice have raised questions about how we should work with Wikipedia. So questions have been raised about public relations practice, which need now to be addressed, and then the answers that we come to about how we're going to work with Wikipedia need to be explained widely, so that in future when somebody goes to Wikipedia, they'll know that if public relations has been involved in any shaping of the content, then the rules by which that contribution from public relations has been made are known.
And actually in that piece of work we're trying to affect mutual understanding between the PR community and Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And so what better way than to have open dialogue? And interestingly, one of the most pertinent points about that is trying to explain what we see public relations, what one might call best practice, but then I'm not quite sure that's clear and adds any clearer definition at all, what best practice public relations is, so that the people we're talking to in the Wikipedian community know where we're coming from, as opposed to the spin end of the spectrum that winds you up.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that, I mean, the world is changing so fast. That's a cliche, but it's true. You know, newspapers are closing all the time, and the internet is becoming ever more significant. And I think that, you know, I do think there are questions to answer about AstroTurf campaigns, about you know, so-called meat puppets and sock puppets. You know, on anonymous posting on message boards, endorsing products online, and so on. I think those questions need to be asked, and I think that discussion would be beneficial within the PR community. But I suppose the thing that I'm really concerned about is, and the internet, the rise of the internet contributes to this, is that the internet obscures the power relations that are at stake here. You know, there is a two-way conversation between corporations and consumers, but it's not a level playing field. You know, that companies have resources to employ PR, and you know, while I'm in favour of transparency, we also do need to talk about power.
Definitely, and I think
but that does sound like it could be a topic for another show, because we're right at the end of time. Jon, Eliane, thank you very much for coming in here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been an interesting debate. Get Reel's in all good bookshops right now. Thanks again to the production team here at Marketeers 4DC, without whom we'd just be sitting on a sofa somewhere else talking to ourselves. So thank you very much. And don't forget, you can watch and download any episode of CIPR TV. The whole back catalogue is available via iTunes and, of course, at CIPR.tv. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.